In the days following Donald Trump's reported strike on Venezuela and his renewed threat to seize Greenland, even suggesting force if necessary, he has also issued sharp warnings toward Colombia, Mexico, and Cuba, prompting a wave of concern across the region about whether the United States is attempting to reimpose its influence over the entire Western Hemisphere, from North America through Central America and deep into South America. To understand why these threats are multiplying and whether they should be taken seriously, it helps to revisit the immediate context and the latest claims circulating. Last weekend, according to the account presented here, US forces carried out an operation in Venezuela and removed Nicolás Maduro, in a move described as blatantly inconsistent with international law, with Maduro having remained in power after 2024 elections that were widely accused of major fraud, and with Trump now portraying his objective in unusually direct terms, namely to exploit and control Venezuelan oil on the ground. As additional details were reported by Venezuelan authorities, the country's interior ministry claimed that at least 100 people were killed and a similar number injured during the US operation, and the aftermath inside Venezuela has allegedly been marked by a heavy crackdown led by political forces still loyal to Maduro, including a state decree ordering the arrest of anyone accused of promoting or supporting the US-led armed action, while also reportedly sweeping up journalists. All of this unfolding in a broader environment where human rights violations are frequently alleged and where press freedom is said to be among the worst globally, with the country placed near the bottom of international rankings. Then, within roughly 48 hours of the Venezuela operation, Trump's language widened beyond Caracas, and these new threats have not been dismissed as mere theatrics the way some earlier statements sometimes were, because several South American leaders now interpret the pattern as a possible return to coercive, imperial-style influence, with the first major signal aimed at Cuba when Trump suggested the Cuban system looked close to collapse, a message reinforced by Marco Rubio, who implied that if he were living in Havana and serving in the Cuban government, he would be at least somewhat worried, language widely read as hinting that US intervention, direct or indirect, could also be on the table. Cuba's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, condemned the Venezuela operation as brutal and treacherous and characterized Maduro's seizure as crude and barbaric, a reaction consistent with the fact that Cuba has been a historic ally of Venezuela and has maintained deeply hostile relations with Washington for more than 6 decades, rooted in Cold War history when the revolutionary communist leader Fidel Castro decisively turned away from the United States and aligned with Soviet Union, a shift that helped trigger the US economic embargo on Cuba, an embargo that remains in force today and continues to restrict trade, investment, and access to global financial channels, even as the island faces a severe economic crisis. Within this narrative, Trump's post-Venezuela argument is that Cuba is especially vulnerable because it relied heavily on Venezuelan oil, and if the United States now controls or redirects the revenues and flows tied to that oil, Cuba could struggle to hold on. Which is why Trump claims he may not even need to intervene militarily, because he expects the Cuban government to fall under pressure on its own through energy shortages, financial strain, and cascading instability. But Cuba is only one part of the picture, because Trump's warnings also targeted Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor, and a country widely associated, rightly or wrongly, with major drug trafficking routes. And during a recent exchange with reporters, he said a military operation in Colombia sounded like a good idea, while also attacking Colombia's left-leaning president, Gustavo Petro, with crude personal threats and allegations that Petro is a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, claims framed here as plainly false, especially given that Colombia has long debated not whether to fight drug trafficking, but how to fight it. And Petro, even if controversial and employing different methods than his predecessors, publicly maintains that combating the drug trade remains an objective. Petro is also presented as especially critical of Trump's use of military force in the region, which would make him a natural political target in a broader confrontation over sovereignty and US influence. And yet, after several tense hours and days, Trump announced that following phone call he would receive Petro at the White House in the near future, raising uncertainty about whether this signals de-escalation or a potentially humiliating, high-pressure meeting given the recent history of sharply confrontational Oval Office diplomacy. Mexico became the third major focus when Trump argued the country must get its act together, claiming drugs are flowing and that the United States will have to do something, including, again, floating the option of deploying US troops directly into Mexico against cartel networks, a red line for Mexico's sovereignty, to which Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, responded with a sweeping rejection of any single power's claim over the hemisphere, stating that the American continent belongs to no doctrine and no empire. The larger question is why these hostile declarations have come in such a tight cluster, and while there are many possible motivations, one explanation emphasized here is a resource-driven imperial logic focused on strategic commodities, most notably Venezuelan oil, combined with a desire to reshape the political landscape of the region by pressuring governments seen as ideologically hostile. Because Trump has recently said he wants good neighbors, a phrase that, in this framing, means neighbors aligned with his political worldview rather than merely cooperative states, which is why Cuba's leadership and Colombia's left-wing government are treated not simply as diplomatic counterparts, but as adversaries. Beyond resources and ideology, the text argues that Trump appears to be reviving the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Americas should remain under US influence while playfully rebranding it as a Monroe Doctrine, signaling a more personal transactional approach to hemispheric power, and this reassertion is also described as an attempt to counter the growing footprint of China in South America, where Chinese investment has expanded across infrastructure, energy, and trade. These moves have triggered mixed reactions. In Venezuela, some reportedly celebrated Maduro's removal because of allegations of human rights abuses and repeated claims of illegitimate elections, yet many international officials and heads of state have warned about the precedent of a powerful country using force to remove a foreign leader, with Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, warning of a dangerous precedent and urging full respect for international law, while Emmanuel Macron argued that the United States is increasingly stepping outside international rules and drifting away from some allies, describing what he sees as a rising neocolonial aggressiveness in diplomatic relations. The broader global backdrop also includes Trump's threat to strike Iran very hard if demonstrators are killed by Iranian authorities in the context of protests that began over cost of living issues and then reportedly grew into a much larger wave of opposition to an authoritarian system, with multiple NGOs and news agencies claiming deaths linked to the crackdown, suggesting Trump is placing coercive warnings not only across the Americas, but also in the Middle East. In the same overall news cycle referenced here, attention also turned to domestic unrest in France, as farmers drove roughly 100 tractors into Paris at the call of Coordination Rurale, moving near the Eiffel Tower and Arc de Triomphe, before gathering in front of the National Assembly to demand the withdrawal of a future EU-Mercosur free trade agreement and stronger management of livestock disease, despite a prefectural order restricting tractor access in parts of the capital, with the group claiming arrests and impounds and with additional actions reported in other regions, while lawmakers including Yael Braun-Pivet met representatives as FNCA demanded what it called a strong signal from the Prime Minister. Weather also featured prominently as a violent storm described as a weather bomb approached northern France, with Météo France issuing top-level warnings in Manche for exceptional winds and anticipating major disruptions to road, rail, air, and maritime transport, as well as potential damage to power and telecom networks, and with France's Transport Minister, Philippe Tabarot, urging affected residents to be extremely cautious in their travel. Internationally, the text also reports that the United States withdrew from dozens of international organizations after a decree signed by Trump, including key climate-related bodies connected to the UN framework on climate change, with critics warning that reduced US participation could weaken global coordination against climate change and that the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement requested in 2025 would take effect by late January. Inside the United States, another incident described here involved an immigration enforcement officer fatally shooting a woman during an operation in Minneapolis, with the Department of Homeland Security framing it as self-defense, while local political figures disputed that interpretation and pointed to videos circulating online, and with Trump defending the officer and blaming the radical left for endangering law enforcement, As NGOs criticized alleged abusive practices in stricter immigration operations, the news roundup also referenced two French studies by INSERM drawing a link between high consumption of certain food additives and increased risks of cancer and type 2 diabetes, based on the Nutrinet Santé cohort tracking over 100,000 adults across many years, with additional data points suggesting hundreds of thousands of food products contain preservatives, according to Open Food Facts. Finally, the report mentioned fossil discoveries near Casablanca in Morocco, dated to roughly 773,000 years ago, and attributed not to Homo sapiens but to a different extinct human relative, presented as evidence that multiple human lineages coexisted in North Africa during that period, underlining the region's significance in the deep history of humanity. Taken together, these updates paint a tense international climate in which Trump's confrontational posture, especially across the Americas after the Venezuela operation, has become the headline driver of fear and speculation, because the underlying logic described here is not merely reactive security policy but a broader attempt to reshape influence, control strategic resources, pressure ideologically hostile governments, and reassert a hemispheric order where Washington sets the terms, even as allies and international institutions warn that the precedent of unilateral force could destabilize norms far beyond the region. Thanks for watching, see you next time.